Welcome to Shattered Reality with your hosts Kate Valentine and Fahrusha. Prepare to have your paradigms shifted and your truths questioned. And now, Shattered Reality.
Well, hi there, listeners. Here we are. It's already July 26th, 2016. And boy, do we have an exciting show for you today. There's somebody who has inspired me since I was a teenager. This gentleman, Dr. Stanley Krippner, I've met him twice. Once at a presentation he did in Brooklyn nearly 2 years ago, and then again in Boulder, Colorado this summer at the Society for Scientific Exploration Symposium. Now, Dr. Krippner is the Alan Watts Professor of Psychology currently at Saybrook University in Oakland, California, and he is coming to us via Skype from Oakland. And I'd like to say a few words about him before I actually introduce him and say hello. Dr. Stanley Krippner is perhaps the world's most famous and highly regarded parapsychologist. He is an expert on dreams, dream telepathy, shamanism, hypnosis, and healing states of consciousness. But more than all this, the one thing that stands out to me about Dr. Stan is the fact that he is a collaborator. When you look him up on Amazon, there are 421 results for books, and many of them are collaborations. He is very generous with his time and his energy, and he is a kind and friendly man. He was an important inspiration in my life early on because I read his book with co-author Montague Ullman called Dream Telepathy when I was still in high school, when I was a teenager. I wanted so much to participate in the program, but alas, the program was already over at this time. This program took place, by the way, at Maimonides Hospital in Brooklyn, New York, and he was really an inspiration to me. Later, I read Becoming Psychic with a different co-author, a man whose name is, let me see here, Stephen Kirloff. And maybe I'll be corrected on that pronunciation. In any case, I later read Becoming Psychic when I was already working in the psychic field as a reader and an intuitive, and it was very inspirational and informational as well. Recently, I've read Healing States, which was co-written with Alberto Villoldo, and that is a shamanic book, one of his several shamanic books. So now, without any further ado, let me introduce Dr. Stanley Krippner. Hi.
Hi, Fahrusha. It's nice to talk to you.
It's wonderful to talk to you as well. In about 1 minute, we will have Kate Valentine, my co-host, here with me. But just to start off, and I want you to speak a lot, but I do want to tell you what I did last night before I went to bed. Actually, when I was already in bed, I decided to do what you know as a dream incubation. I didn't do any big mystical ceremony. All I did was to give myself the instruction, the intention, if you will, that I would dream about anything I needed to know about today's interview to make it go successfully. And then I went to bed and I went to sleep. And all of a sudden, I was feeling very happy. I was somewhat awake and I was feeling very happy. And I thought, oh, that's wonderful. We had a wonderful interview with Dr. Stan. And we had such a great interview. Not only that, but it went really, really well. And I'm very, very happy. And then I rolled over in bed and it was dark out. And I realized, oh my goodness, that was a dream. So I didn't really get any tips, but I did have the dream that I intended to dream. I don't remember too many details, but it was really a very satisfactory experience to intend a dream and to have it happen.
I think that's quite remarkable, and I think that what you can learn from that is that setting the intention often works, and maybe you can try it again.
I sure will. So, could you please start out by talking to us a little bit about your work with the Dream Lab at Maimonides Hospital in Brooklyn? How it
Well,
came to
yes, I'll
be?
be happy to. And in the first place, I do have to make a correction. I'm certainly not the most famous parapsychologist in the world. I think there are a dozen people from different parts of the world who actually are much more famous than I am in terms of media, in terms of documentaries, in terms of publications. When you say I'm the most highly regarded, that might be a different thing for the simple reason that I get along much better with the critics of parapsychology than many of my colleagues do, because I can see their point of view, and I'm always very open to skepticism and thinking twice before one jumps to a conclusion. And this is what characterized our work at Maimonides Medical Center when we did the dream laboratory work for 10 years, an entire decade. And as you noted, I did that with Dr. Montague Ullman, who was the director of the Community Mental Health Center. And it was his idea to take advantage of the new technology, electrocephalographic recording of eye movements, etc., while somebody was asleep, and wake up people in the middle of the night and find out if they were able to dream about a picture that somebody in a different part of the building or even in a different building was looking at. So this is a type of work that we did for 10 years. We obtained a great deal of evidence. We wrote over 100 research articles, one book, and one monograph. So all of that information is available, and your readers can go to a library or go to the internet and look it up. That's the good news. The bad news is that we were not able to do this on demand. It was unpredictable from one night to the next whether the dream telepathy would actually work. When other people tried to replicate our work, sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. So again, we can't say that we have incontrovertible and irrefutable evidence that dream telepathy works because it doesn't work on demand. However, I think that we did do some significant work, and it's found its way into the literature and into many, many publications, both scholarly and popular.
Well, it certainly was extremely inspirational to me when I read the book as a teenager, and you continue to inspire me. And your humbleness in saying that you're not the most well-known parapsychologist is nice, but I do think that you are certainly one of the most published and the most highly regarded, as you will agree with. And in terms of suffering these critics gladly, some of them I can and some of them not as much as you do. So while I think that some of the critics are reasonable in their criticism, others I find not so much so. But I don't really want to go too far into that area today. But I'd rather have you give us an example of one of the dream studies that happened at Maimonides.
Oh, I'd be very happy to give you some examples, and I think your listeners would find it of great interest. Our very first participant was Eileen Garrett, who was the most famous medium of the 20th century and who founded the Parapsychology Foundation, which is having its 65th anniversary this year, and I will be helping to celebrate that anniversary by giving a talk in August at the Brooklyn Museum that you mentioned a little earlier. So I will be returning to Brooklyn and I do come back from time to time after all of these years.
Great.
So anyway, Eileen was in her office, and she was discussing the experiment with Montague Ullman, and so he told her that somebody would be selecting a picture and asked her to try to dream about it. Well, sure enough, she had a dream that night about the Ben-Hur chariot race from the famous movie, which goes back, of course, several decades. And she even described the team of white horses, the team of black horses, and the fact that she wanted to see the movie. Well, the picture that somebody had selected without her knowledge was actually what they call in show business, a glossy print from that exact movie.
That's amazing.
Two protagonists racing the team of horses around the Roman Colosseum. So you can't get any more of a direct hit than that. But there aren't many Eileen Garretts in the world.
That's great. Is it possible that some of the other experimenters failed because the people that they had recruited were not particularly psychic?
You never know who's going to be psychic or not. We picked people who had a history of unusual dreams, and we had a person who actually was a professional psychic. His name was Malcolm Besant. He lived in England. And he participated in quite a remarkable experiment because his assignment was to dream about a series of pictures that would be selected the following day. So this is what we call a precognitive experiment. And to be absolutely sure that there was no possible criticism, the people who ran the machinery and who collected his dreams were from New York University, and they did not know that they were helping a precognitive experiment going on. They just thought this is a run-of-the-mill dream laboratory study, and they duly woke him up whenever they saw the rapid eye movements on the EEG, tape recorded his dreams, and then they left. Well, once Mr. Besant woke up, we had one of our laboratory assistants throw the dice, and the dice, of course, came up with a certain number. And this number directed us to a box, and the box had the pictures in it. And then we were able to see if the pictures corresponded to the dreams. Of course, this was done by people much later, outside judges who tried to do the matches. In one case, Mr. Besant had 3 dreams about birds. One dream was about birds in the laboratory, one dream was about birds in the forest, one dream was about birds in the lake. Well, the picture that was randomly selected was a series of photographs of a dozen birds.
Wow.
Again, that's what you call a direct hit. You don't get any closer than that. Mr. Besant was able to do this accurately night after night and attained what we call high degrees of statistical significance. 1 out of several thousand that this could be due to chance. And he did this not only one time, he came back the next summer and did it twice. So this is all written up, this is in the literature, and we have yet to find a decent criticism of this work. There have been some irrational criticisms, by the way, and I answered all of them in my chapter in a book called Debating Psychic Experiences. And I took a list of all of the criticisms that have been made, found that all of them were off the wall, irrational or inaccurate, except for one. This cannot be readily repeated. No, it can't. That's a valid criticism. Well, to this day, Wikipedia has published all those false accusations, and I cannot get Wikipedia to change it. So, these accusations and untruths linger on.
Well, Wikipedia, while I have used it from time to time to find out information, I've decided to try not to use it any longer or use it as little as possible because of their kind of mechanistic mindset that does not give proper attribution to contributions in consciousness by a number of people, including our recent guest, Russell Targ, and other folks who I have a great deal of respect for. I don't know how they treat Dean Radin, but I know that they don't treat Russell Targ very well, that they may not treat you very well, nor Rupert Sheldrake. So I'm kind of down on Wikipedia at the moment, and I am going to encourage people through this podcast and elsewhere not to rely for the accuracy of Wikipedia simply because their contributors are biased.
It's not only that, but when somebody tries to post a correction on Wikipedia, it's immediately taken down. I will not let my students use Wikipedia in their research papers. And I think that Wikipedia does have a number of positive things. I like to look at Wikipedia for movie reviews, for example.
Okay.
And there are other things that are very dependable upon Wikipedia. But when it comes to consciousness, alternative medicine, mind-brain interactions, no, you cannot depend upon them because they're terribly biased.
Well, I agree, and even on things that are not necessarily involving psychic phenomena, but rather things like a Dr. Feelgood. Do you remember him, Dr. Max Jacobson? Do you remember him, Kate?
Absolutely. And thanks for your patience. And I got tied up in traffic. Dr. Krippner, it's a pleasure to
yes,
have you
Kate's
on the
with
show.
us now. But
Sure,
Dr. Max...
It was the old vitamin B shots. Along
Yeah,
with
he used to give amphetamines and vitamin B shots to Nixon and Kennedy and other people. However, I'm acquainted with a member of his family, and she told me that he was born in Poland and that he, at a very young age, emigrated to Berlin. And they have him listed as being born in Germany in a different year. And I attempted to send a suggestion that he was actually born right across the border from the Frankfurt. On one side is Germany, on the other side is another name of the town, and they refused to even consider the fact that his own daughter happened to say that he was born in Poland, and who would know if not his daughter?
Mm-hmm.
Well, there you are. That's another example of their insistence that they know the truth and nobody else does.
I'm going to stick with dreams for the moment right now, and I know that you have continued to work with dreams, both as a healing modality and continuing on with kind of a study that you have done recently, and you presented some of the findings from that at the SSE this summer. So would you like to talk to that recent study a little bit with the woman who was part Native American and the person that she worked with who was a Native American and was really the true recipient of these dream messages?
Oh, I'll be very happy to talk about that. And your listeners can actually go to my website and they can read the whole study. And my website is www.stanleykrippner, which is one word, Weebly, WEEBLY.com. So I was in correspondence for a year with a woman who works with the U.S. Army to provide special events for servicemen and servicewomen. And she actually has a history of unusual dreams. But one night she had a dream about a soldier who claimed that he was killed in Iraq. And her associate, who was an assistant chaplain, Native American, was near, and so she shared the dream with him. And he knew the soldier because he had served in Iraq with that soldier. And the names and the places matched exactly. So that was the beginning of a whole series of dreams. And before her friend, the assistant chaplain, was transferred to another base, there were 12 dreams that she sent me, and each one of them gave very, very specific information, including names and places of servicemen who died in Afghanistan or Iraq, one exception being a family member. Now, again, you have to take a look at something like this from a number of different points of view. And some people will say, well, they were in collusion, they were trying to fool you. In the first place, you have to ask, what would be their motive? This is a very complicated way to do a hoax. And secondly, if they were in collusion, remember that they're in the US Army, and any behavior like this is unethical. And if it were brought to the courts or to the military tribunals, they could be dishonorably discharged or worse. So, as members of the US military, the risk would have been too great to perpetuate a hoax like this. Another possibility would be that it was a coincidence. Well, when you have specific names and places, it really stretches the boundaries of coincidence. Another one would be poor memory. They might have been talking about these service people, and that triggered the dream. But as a matter of fact, they did not discuss his previous work in the Middle East. They had enough to discuss in terms of people on the base in the United States that they were working with. And then a final possibility is that this was telepathy, that she, as the dreamer, was unconsciously reading the mind of the assistant chaplain, had access to his memory bank, and was able to incorporate his memory of the soldiers into her dreams. Well, this is possible. It's pretty far-fetched, but yes, it's possible. And I think that's the only viable alternative explanation. Now, I think the more interesting question is, why did these service people who died at a fairly young age come to her in her dreams? And they all said the same thing. We want to assure our loved ones and other people who have lost young friends in the war that we're on the other side, we're happy, we're in bliss, we're enjoying ourselves, and they shouldn't spend too much time grieving for us. So that was actually a very joyous message. And again, you can say, well, as part of the telepathy, of course you want to give it a happy ending. So even though this is not conclusive about life after death, I think it's a pretty good piece of evidence that one can use to say it certainly is suggestive of life after death, and that the deceased can make contact with somebody who is receptive enough to have the contact in their dreams. So then the question comes up, why didn't they come to the assistant chaplain in his dreams? Because he was Native American, he knew shamans, this type of experience was common to him and his family. Well, the deceased servicemen said he simply was not receptive. That's why they had to go through him. He didn't remember his dreams. They couldn't get through to him on a dream level, but they could get through to her because she had a whole history of unusual dreams.
Wow.
Yeah, so there you have the story, and it's a fascinating one.
It certainly is. And it does bring up that one of our listeners named Yvette has written me a note and said if I might ask you, and I wasn't sure I was going to ask you, but she wrote to me about a dream that she had about a deceased former boyfriend, lover, whatever you want to call him, and he had passed away some years ago, and she had a very, it wasn't a disturbing dream while she was having it, she told me, but rather after she woke up, she became disturbed. It was a dream where she said she was visiting different apartment houses. She was supposed to meet him. And in looking back on it, she says the dream was very gray. In the finality of the dream, she did hear his voice calling to her and offering to give her some food of some sort, and that he would be there in a moment. But during the dream, she saw disabled persons, and the dream was very gray, while she ordinarily dreamt in color. And she was fearing that this man, a middle-aged man, was actually in some form of purgatory, or had failed to go to the light, or however you want to frame that in a particular belief system, but she was afraid that he was not totally at peace. And so she asked me, because we had announced your being on ahead of time, if you would have anything to say about that, and I didn't know whether I was going to be able to bring it up or not.
Well, you can certainly bring it up, and remember, I am not an expert, and I don't think anybody is an expert on life after death, but I can make a couple of comments. First of all, the fact that it was in gray might simply have been a matter of alerting her that this was an unusual dream and she should pay attention to it, because her dreams are usually in color. So the gray might not indicate mood so much as being an alert system for her. Now, the fact that he was not totally at peace, well, again, from what I've read and from what I've experienced in terms of talking with folks who have near-death experiences, there's a transition. And the transition is not always a smooth one. This transition has bumpy ones, and this is why the Native American shamans with whom I've worked spend a great deal of time helping the deceased through these bumpy spots and making their passage as pleasant as possible. So I think that the fact that she had the dream might prompt her to do some praying, might do some meditation, might call upon her spirit guides if she has any, to help make his transition much more pleasant than it was in the dream.
Well, that's very good advice indeed, Dr. Stan. And
yeah, what I have to emphasize is I'm happy to give my opinion on this, but like I say, we know so little about this, at least in my opinion, we know so little about it, that I give my suggestions and people simply have to take that for what it's worth. One of the most interesting things about near-death experiences, and also the experiences of the young woman I worked with, is that the reports about after death don't really conform with what you read about or hear about from the major religions, especially the Western religions. You don't have, shall we say, dogmatic or doctrinaire accounts that really support the religious dogmas that they've been coming up with for hundreds of years. Life is much more complicated than what a lot of mainstream religions would like to think is simple and cut and dried. So this is why I urge people to, yes, if you are a religious person, if you go to church or temple or synagogue or whatever, of course, if this gives you some faith, if it gives you some comfort, go ahead and do it, but don't think you have to believe everything that you hear.
Well, I would agree with that, and I would say further that in studying near-death experiences, one can find a lot of interest and perhaps contemporaneous comfort in that. I'm not saying that religions don't comfort. I think they probably do comfort some people. But the fact that you are reading about someone who is contemporaneous to oneself, who's had a near-death experience, or a child that comes back with a tale of reincarnation, which is provable by some facts that they're reporting about the purported previous life, does, to me, give a lot more comfort than something that I have to believe that may have been translated and mistranslated hundreds of times. And
Well, that's so true. So true. And I have a couple of comments on what you just said. The mistranslations in the Bible are numerous. And one of them that was very serious was when Saint Jerome translated the Bible into Vulgate Latin, and he mistranslated a word when in the Old Testament, when the prophets are talking about the people we should stay away from, and we should stay away from sorcerers and witches, etc. But they said, stay away from people who work with dreams.
Oh, my.
That was a mistranslation, and that mistranslation set the study of dreams back 1,000 years because people, like scholars in the Middle Ages, refused to get involved with dreams because they thought that was all the work of the devil. Now, there are some minor mistranslations that are not so serious. In the New Testament, there is a passage about Jesus, and when he came into Jerusalem on the back of a horse on what today is called Palm Sunday, and for emphasis, the author says, yes, and a foal of the son of a horse. They used other words, but that was the gist of it. That was their way to emphasize it. So what did artists do? They had Jesus come in on a horse trailing a second horse. Well, that was to conform to a mistranslation and a misunderstanding of the scripture.
Oh, my.
Yeah, so a lot of people think that because these sacred books come directly from God, they must be accurate. Well, maybe they do come from a divine source, but they have to come through human channels, and human channels are not always dependable, especially when you go from one language to the next.
Well, I would certainly agree with that, and what gives that more credence, certainly, than just you and or I speaking, is that the fact that there are so many different denominations of any given religion. I mean, I suppose I know more about Christianity than I do about Shintoism, for instance, but there are so many different denominations of Christianity that argue with one another and all think they've got the true book, and as well as Judaism and Islam as well.
100 varieties of Christianity. There are 77 varieties of Islam, and there are 3 major Jewish denominations. And then when you go to Eastern religions, good heavens, think of the dozens of varieties of Buddhism, for example.
Yes.
And so anybody that claims that they know the truth, you have to say which truth, because there are so many hundreds of them that are out on the marketplace. But I did want to comment about the past life issue, because there has been some very scholarly research done at the University of Virginia, and the most recent turn that it's taken is about children who remember past lives, even from the United States, where past lives are discounted not only by mainstream science, but by the major Western religions. And the children have been coming up with very, very specific names and places, and in many cases, these can be tracked down and verified. And so I would suggest that your readers consider getting or going to the library and reading a book of mine called The Varieties of Anomalous Experience. And this book was edited by Etzel Cardania, Stephen Lynn, and myself. 2000 is the original edition. It was the second edition, only goes back to 2014. It's a brand new edition. We have a whole chapter on what science has told us about past life reports. Now, you wouldn't take this book seriously unless you knew that this was published by the American Psychological Association, which is mainstream science.
Yes, it is.
The American Psychological Association has very, very strict standards for publication. And so in that chapter, we present, different sides of the story. We take a very skeptical point of view, but we do present some evidence that's very, very hard to easily discount. Also, there are chapters about psychic healing. There are chapters about lucid dreaming, a number of chapters that would be of interest to many of your
Sounds
listeners.
Like a great compilation there. It sounds really excellent. And to sort of change directions a little bit, you have been very closely involved with healing states of consciousness, and the book that I have read most recently, which is called Healing States, you got involved with that in that book, at least anyway, Dr. Alberto Villoldo. I have a hard time sometimes with pronunciation of names, but and which you and he had taken trips together and separately to South America.
Well, Dr. Villoldo, who's actually written half a dozen books on his own since the book that you mentioned was published, is really a masterful storyteller. And he has written a recent book about healing experiences, including a healing experience that saved his life when he was in South America and had to visit shamans. And because he's a medical anthropologist, his work is very closely documented and it's put into the right anthropological context. And as you say, the book Healing States, which you just read, is a book that talks about our joint trips to Brazil, but also his trips to Peru and my trips to visit Rolling Thunder and other Native American healers. And I think that your listeners would find it an extremely interesting story. Also, I've recently written a book called The Voice of Rolling Thunder with Sidian Morningstar Jones, Rolling Thunder's grandson. And there are a lot of intriguing stories in that book about Rolling Thunder. And one of the stories I'll be happy to share with you and your listeners was the story about how a young photographer who had a blooming career was diagnosed with a rare blood disease and had only 3 months to live. And so in desperation, he went to see Rolling Thunder, who allowed him to camp out in Nevada on his property. And Rolling Thunder did cleansing, sweat lodge, herbal teas, chanting, prayers to the great spirits. At the end of 3 months, the photographer was still alive.
Great.
And at the end of 6 months, he felt so well he thought he could get back to work. But Rolling Thunder had not allowed him to take a photograph. Rolling Thunder was very, very averse to being photographed because he likes to keep a low profile. And on one of the last days of the visit, a friend came to join the photographer, whose name was Carrie, and his friend brought to Carrie a little baby owl who had fallen, a little baby eagle who had fallen from a nest.
Oh.
And he said, we've got to take this baby eagle to Rolling Thunder. I think the baby eagle's wing is damaged, and Rolling Thunder will know what to do because he has a special affinity to eagles. And so they took the little baby eagle to Rolling Thunder, yakking and squawking and screaming. As soon as Rolling Thunder touched the eagle, it calmed down, and Rolling Thunder held the eagle in his hands, and then he turned to Carrie and said, you want a picture of me? Now you can take the picture.
Okay.
So Carrie took the picture, and immediately after he took the picture, the eagle flew back to its nest.
Amazing.
And that's the picture on the cover of the book, Rolling Thunder holding the eagle.
So can you tell us how you became acquainted with Rolling Thunder?
Well, I was very fortunate to have known and worked with Rolling Thunder for over 20 years before his death at an advanced age. And he had a very intense life and a very controversial life because he was a militant in terms of Native American rights. And so he did make a lot of people angry. And he was such a militant that he was actually the target of an assassination attempt. They missed him, but they left a bullet hole in the wall of his house.
Uh-oh.
Great pride in showing me and the other people the bullet hole. He had just leaned down to tie his shoelace when the rifle was fired, and all it hit was the wall, thank heavens. So Rolling Thunder thought the Great Spirit must have been with him that day.
I think he was.
But I met Rolling Thunder through the Grateful Dead, of all people. I went to a party for Alaraka, who was a famous musician from India, and Alaraka played tabla for Ravi Shankar, the most famous musician from India, time, who brought the ragas to the United States and to England, where they were championed by the Beatles. And one of Alaraka's students was Mickey Hart. He was teaching Mickey Hart how to play the tabla. So Mickey Hart was at the party, and Mickey Hart had some questions for me about hypnosis, because this was an interest to him. And we had a nice conversation. And then, completely out of the blue, Mickey asked me if I liked rock music. And I said, oh, yes, I went to hear the Grateful Dead just 2 nights ago. And then Mickey beamed from ear to ear. Then you heard me play. I played drums with the Grateful Dead.
Wow.
If Mickey had not asked that question, I would never have met Rolling Thunder. Because then Mickey and I became close friends, and he kept saying, I want you to meet this Native American medicine man who I've known. And so on one occasion, when I was staying with Mickey at his ranch in California, he got a private plane to pick up Rolling Thunder and bring him to the ranch so that we could meet. So that's how I met Rolling Thunder.
That's a great story.
That is an amazing, isn't it? Isn't it, Kate? That's, and it just goes to show you how synchronicity works.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And how music gets tied into a lot of psychic phenomena.
Yes, indeed. Music is tied to psychic phenomena, I think.
And to this day, the main remaining members of the Grateful Dead are touring. They call themselves Dead and Company. Your listeners might like to take in one of their concerts when they come to your area.
Oh, absolutely. I know a lot of listeners who would love to do just that. Did you have a question, Kate?
Not really. I mean, I was just wondering what the state of parapsychology is today. I mean, it's listening to you, I think it's so funny that you always have to prove, double prove, triple prove, and so on. Whereas, someone who's, let's say, investigating a various amino acid, nope, these are the results, and everyone goes, oh, okay. But something like parapsychology, it just takes so much proof. I mean, I understand why, but it always has annoyed me. But what do you think the state of the field is today? You
can ask a number of people this question.
Mm-hmm.
I would say parapsychology is still hanging on. It's hanging in there. I go to Parapsychological Association conventions year after year,
mm-hmm.
and the numbers really don't change much. Between 100 and 300 people at the conventions, 300 at the most. Very, very small numbers when you think of the importance of the field. And the laboratories are underfunded. There's only half a dozen of them operating in the world. And the journals have very, very high standards. And so the articles that are published in the journals usually are pretty rigorously designed. And one of the main critics of parapsychologically oriented studies is Ray Hyman, who's also a friend of mine, University of Oregon. And he says most of the skeptics don't realize how well designed most parapsychological experiments are. And yes, they are well designed, but you see, parapsychology is not going to sweep the world by storm unless it can do one of three things. Unless it has a practical application that is dependable. Psychic healing is not dependable. Predicting the stock market is not dependable. Helping out in romance is certainly not dependable. Secondly, a repeatable experiment. A lot of sciences have experiments that can be done and redone by other laboratories all over the world.
That's the problem.
Psychology has some fairly repeatable experiments, but nothing that is easily repeatable. And then third is a theoretical explanation that will fit in with mainstream Western science. Now, this is a tough one because there's a lot of theories of parapsychology and some very good ones. I'd recommend that your listeners look at the book First Sight by James Carpenter. That's a psychological theory about how psychic abilities were part of human evolution and how they still play an important role whether we know it or not. Okay, but that does not fit in with mainstream Western science, which, as you said before, is very mechanistic. So I think that until parapsychology can break not all three of those, but just one of those three barriers, it's still going to be on the fringe. And we just have to keep doing what research we can do, and we can take seriously the worthwhile criticisms from outsiders, but we just have to dismiss the irrational criticisms.
Well, that's a good approach. And I wanted to make two comments on what you just said. The first one is, and after I make the second one, I wonder if you could comment on is it the experimenter effect? The bias of the experimenter makes a difference in how all sorts of scientific experiments turn out. That's my first comment. And my second comment is, did not some of the research at the physics lab, the Pear lab in Princeton, do away with the non-repeatability because although the effect was statistically small but very significant in some of the experiments that they did? Those are my two comments on that.
Well, those are very good questions. You're talking about the former Pear lab at the University of Princeton, and they did excellent work for a couple of decades, and then when Robert John and Brenda Dunn retired, they just closed the lab, much to the relief of the physics department and the engineering department, by the way. And so now they're writing books about what they learned. And they did a lot of worthwhile work, but as you say, the effects were very, very small. But they did hundreds of thousands of runs, and so the accumulated data were overwhelmingly significant. So what needs to be done is people in other laboratories to pick up and try to get the same effects. Now, one of the things they did at Princeton was the effect of what's called the Global Consciousness Project. And what one of the members of the group, Roger Nelson, did was to have parapsychological devices all around the world called random number or random effect generators, REGs. Sometimes they use numbers, sometimes they use subatomic particles. But these little devices will randomly flash on a red light or a green light, just randomly. However, when there is some earth-shaking event, such as the death of Princess Diana, there is a strange synchronization among these little machines. They all start to behave in the same way and flash those red lights or green lights on at the same time. And again, the effects are very, very small. But you find this over and over again, including the attacks on the World Trade Power and the Pentagon, where you not only had a massive effect just afterwards, but you even had a little but statistically significant effect the day before this was going to take place. Indeed. Just as if they were reading the minds of the terrorists and knew that this was going to happen. So nobody else has done this, but this would be a wonderful experiment for some other team to try to repeat. Absolutely. Especially because these little random event generators are so inexpensive and they just operate by themselves and record bits of data 24 hours a day. Now, people in parapsychology think that this is an important finding, but some of them say, yes, but it's all experimenter effect. Roger Nelson and his team expect there to be a blip when there is an earth-shaking event. And so this is what is being measured, not the effect of the event itself, whether it be a tragic event like the death of Princess Diana or a happy event such as the World Cup or the Olympics.
Right.
So that's an example of experimenter effect, one of many, many. The experimenter effect, as you said, happens in mainstream psychology. It even happens in mainstream physics, where you have the uncanny phenomenon of waves and particles. If you're looking for a wave, you get data that support waves. If you're looking for particles from light and other sources, you get something that looks like a particle. And so experimenter effect, the person doing the experiment, is something that's a part of all science. It used to be thought that science was so neutral, the experimenter was apart from the experiment and was an unbiased observer and designer. No, that's not true. The experimenter in any type of science, the research in any type of science, is a part of that experiment, and you've got to build that into the experiment and to the study and acknowledge that when you write it up.
Wow. Well, that is certainly something to take into consideration.
You have this right down the line on anthropology. The famous anthropologist Margaret Mead went to Samoa, and she was asking young women about their sex lives, and she expected them to say that they had a much more uninhibited sexual life than Western girls back in the 1930s did. And she wrote a famous book, Coming of Age in Samoa.
Yes.
Then another investigator studied this, and he did not find that this was the truth at all. And it's very possible that Margaret Mead, famous though she was, the experimenter affected her interviews. And the respondents, these young girls, simply told her what they thought they wanted her to hear. I think she would have done the different experiment. She would have done a little bit more controlled work if she had done it today. But these are the things you learn as science progresses.
I greatly admired Margaret Mead myself. Especially baffling was her statement that she didn't understand depression because she was never ever depressed. She said something to the effect that she had never been depressed in her life.
No, she was a very happy, joyous person. I knew Margaret Mead. She was just marvelous. And of course, she was very favorably inclined toward parapsychology. And she's the one that argued before the American Association for the Advancement of Science, saying, yes, admit them to membership because they follow all the scientific rules. And the council did vote in the Parapsychological Association as a member. And it remains in the AAAS camp today. And Margaret Mead, of course, was very viciously attacked by people that didn't like her approach. But she always used the term, let's not call it extrasensory perception, ESP, let's call it extended sensory perception, because we don't know how long and how far the senses project themselves. And she was thinking in terms of what a lot of Native Americans call the long body. The human body does not end where the skin ends.
Right.
The body extends into the family, into the clan, into the whole tribe, and ultimately into whole nature. And so Native Americans, especially before the European invasion, Native Americans had no problems accepting precognitive dreams or past life memories because this was part of the long body.
Well, that's very true, and your former collaborator, Alberto Viodo, I hope I've said that correctly this time. He studied, if I'm correct here, places that are still existent both in the South Seas and South America, where the indigenous populations, meet together in the morning for dream work.
Yes,
share their dreams.
Not only in South America, this is done in various parts of the world, including Southeast Asia, where a family or even a group will gather in the morning and we'll talk about the dreams and see what benefits they can derive from the dreams. This is something that is practiced in very, very few American families, and certainly not in American communities, because America is a dream-deprived society. We don't really pay much attention to dreams, and this is why the International Association for the Study of Dreams, IASD, is such a wonderful corrective, because this is a group that has regional conferences, it has annual conferences in different parts of the world, and gives people, both lay people and experts and scientists, a chance to talk about the most recent findings in dreams, and extraordinary dreams, such as psychic dreams, are certainly welcome at these meetings. And again, your listeners can look up the ISD website and find out all about the activities of this wonderful organization.
Well, Dr. Stanley Krippner, we have been so fortunate to have you here on Shattered Reality Podcast today. And the only unfortunate thing is that our time for today is just about up. And we would like to extend an invitation for you to come back again in a couple of months and give you a moment to mention again your association this summer in August with the Morbid Anatomy Museum, where you're going to be giving another presentation, or is it at the actual Brooklyn Museum?
The Morbid Anatomy Museum in Brooklyn. You're absolutely right. Just look at my website. It's about August 12th, if I remember the date.
Okay. Well, I
really, Dr. Krippner, I don't have much experience in this particular line. Fahrusha does, so I'm afraid I don't have many questions for you, but it's been a pleasure listening to you. And it's always great to learn something new, which I have. So thank you so much.
Thank you, and your program has to keep on shattering reality.
Okay.
The realities that we live in are not the full picture. And we have to shatter the misconceptions and really look at the underlying values and wisdom that is all too often hidden from us.
Well, thanks again,
Amen.
and we invite you to come back on and talk about hypnotism and more about shamanism and just lots of other subjects that you're an expert on. All right? Thanks again. Bye now.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
So that was our number 36 of our podcasts here. And we're going to take a brief interlude for the month of August, right?
Okay, that's true.
And we're going to come back in September
Swinging.
with great guests. We can't get any greater than Dr. Stanley Krippner and Russell Targ. They're both at the way
High
at the
bar,
top.
high bar.
To beat, but we're not expecting to beat that bar, but we are expecting to continue with really, really quality guests. And at this point, I would like to say a word of appreciation, not only to our engineer, Bill, who we always appreciate, but also to two of our listeners. We have listeners.
All right.
Linda LeBlanc, who has been a long-term supporter of Shattered Reality Podcast, and also Willem Vandenberg, who is also another supporter and SSE members, Society for Scientific Exploration member, and he is very encouraging to our efforts and a big fan of Dr. Krippner and of Russell Targ, as is Linda LeBlanc. So thank you.
And Diane, don't forget Diane.
And Diane. Oh, you please speak her name.
Oh, Diane Denzo out there with Blackboard.
Okay, so that's another one of our big fans and a supporter, and a very lovely lady, I'd have to say, having just met her once.
She is.
She's a lovely person. So I hope you'll continue to listen in to us. Please be aware that we value criticisms and plaudits.
And comments.
Just comments about our podcast and guests, and maybe want to give us hints as to guests you'd like to hear from.
Yeah, but it really, when Rosanna puts a lot of time and effort, she's another one of our famous listeners, and we have heard from her on many occasions. But like her, we'd love to hear from you too, because the more we hear from you, the better quality we're going to get. So thank you to just another fan out there.
Okay, so in terms of Shattered Reality Podcast, enjoy your summer.
Yes.
And signing off, this is Fahrusha.
And Kate Valentine. And have a great summer.
Okay.